Hey guys, Jamie here from Flow Genome Project, checking back in after, goodness gracious, probably a month off our regular Facebook Live. So had a number of folks say, hey, we'd love to, where'd you go on Freaky Fridays and where'd you go with some of your posts? We'd love to have you back. And so we are, and I wanted to give you guys kind of an update on what we've been up to, and then actually have just a quick riff, because this has been up and on my mind lately from our recent trip to New York. So fundamentally, this notion of Maslow's pyramid and Maslow's pyramid scheme, which is what is the intersection these days between our drives for self-actualization, what the psychologist Abraham Maslow laid out, right, in his pyramid, which was that food, clothing, shelter, safety, security, belonging, and then self-actualization or transformation, right? What is the role of that model and that notion in today's contemporary marketplace? So turn on your sound to listen if you'd like. We'll add subtitles to this later, but feel free to jump into this conversation. Owen, great to see you, man. Great to see you. This is actually, Owen was just with us in New York at the Soho House when we were just giving a talk a couple of nights ago, and we didn't even get the chance to swap notes on this, but it was the conversation we'd had earlier that day at Big Think with, what's his bucket? Dr. Barry Scott Kaufman. Scott Barry Kaufman. I think it's Scott Barry Kaufman at Penn, who's been doing some of the leading research on self-actualization, and also not just self-actualization, but he has had, and I might be spilling the beans a little here, because he's just started this project, but he's been granted private access, exclusive access to some of Abe Maslow's original personal journals. And one of the things that he found there is that Abraham Maslow, by the end of his life, and this is little known and not really published, so this is, it's such a, it's a small enough thing, I'm sure he's going to write a great book, and I won't be stealing any of his thunder, but fundamentally, what Abraham Maslow had to say by the end of his life was, paradoxically, he's like, peak experiences, I'm over them. What I really care about are the plateaus. What I really care about is the magical, the enchanted, in the day-to-day. Okay, and so that's pretty radical from one of the folks, and thank you for that first thumbs up. I love to see little bubbles kind of floating across the screen. Keep comments and feedback going. I'll set up some of this conversation, and then would love to just kind of have a jam with you guys. So fundamentally, what does that have to do with today? Well, what that has to do with today is that many people have taken Maslow's pyramid, right? Our yearning for self-transformation, for self-actualization, all those kinds of things, and they've turned it into commerce, right? They're using that drive to sell us more shit. And nowhere is this more prevalent than in the personal growth or personal development space. And it is potentially, you would think, hey, there's, because in our writing of Stealing Fire, one of the things that we looked into was how much time and money are we collectively spending trying to get out of our heads? And so it was, licit and illicit pharmaceuticals. It was all these kind of things. But one of the other main areas we looked at was therapy, self-help, personal development, because those are all trying to say, it's not like I'm trying to learn to balance a spreadsheet, or I'm trying to learn to, fret scales on a violin. I'm just trying to learn to how to relate to my own interior experience more successfully. How do I get out of my worried well self, right? And what we realized is, it's a multi-billion-dollar market. And this little platform, this little walled community called Facebook that we happen to be hanging out with and interacting in today is just choked to the gills with people pitching the promise of the tippy top of Maslow's pyramid. And it's become what we might say is a pyramid scheme, which is a bait and switch, and something that never does and never can deliver the things promised, even though we have become incredibly good at skillfully manipulating others to open their wallets in the promise of that very thing. Okay, and so let's take, and if you guys, many of you have probably seen that recent Tony Robbins documentary. I think it's called I Am Not Your Guru. It was on Netflix, and I got to sit down and watch it this summer. I've never been to a Tony Robbins seminar. I had seen, certainly we have lots of friends, peers, and colleagues interacting in different realms, and people have even sometimes said, and I've never quite taken, like, you could be the next Tony Robbins, and I'm always like, oh dear God, like, no. Right? And I'm also, and also have heard from people directly close to him that all is not quite as it seems from the stage. and that there are many challenges and there are many kind of hiccups and hang-ups in that space. But this is not to talk shit about sort of about the workshop, the workshop or keynote kind of scuttlebutt. This is to say, I watched his documentary very attentively, not so much as an individual, but more from the side of instructional design. What is he doing? How is he doing it? And how effective is it? And honestly, and I had a lot of friends who watched that and were like, oh my God, I watched that. I was skeptical. I was really blown away. I was really impressed. And I had the exact opposite reaction. I was a little sick to my stomach because what it felt like was old technology. It fundamentally felt like baby boomer psychotechnologies developed in the 70s and 80s, right, around the info marketing space, around all of these little prompts and triggers and primes, designed to somewhat cynically manipulate and create a short-term state experience in a large crowd of people with high production values, right, designed to produce a saccharine catharsis, right, which fundamentally means, and if you take a look at what happens in that documentary, there are a couple of things that just really I didn't feel comfortable with. And one of them, I think the first was how many of you have been contemplating suicide? Finding one, going straight up to his face and acting as if that a life that has led someone to that point of despair, right, can meaningfully be resolved in front of thousands of other people with anything resembling a singular breakthrough, right? And many times, and people in the therapeutic community will often say that, like, people who have had suicidal ideation, meaning sometimes I think about it, sometimes I wonder, right? It's rarely at their lowest moments that they actually choose to make an attempt at ending their life. It's often right after some peak, right, or and they're kind of trailing off the backside. So the ability to take something as sensitive and delicate and complex and multifaceted as that, a human being's attempt to say, I want to step off this wheel, right, is profound and potentially troubling, right? Particularly when the idea of, like, oh, change your inner script, or oh, engage in a primal scream, or oh, you're wearing stupid shoes and what does this tell you about yourself, seems more for the showmanship and more for the value. And another example of that was there was a woman in the audience, and he just decided, kind of, based on some, his spidey senses, there's no question the dude's talented and intuitive and all these kind of things, that she wasn't fully happy in her relationship with her partner. And he goaded her on the spot, right, to pick up the phone, call him, and break up with him live. And you think, okay, is this in deepest service, right? Is this actually true and best for this person, for this woman? And she was deeply awkward. She had no ability to say no. It was just like when people talk about teachers and students having sexual relations, or anybody in a position of power, and then someone can say, oh, it was consensual, and then people have rightly said, hey, look, what you might have conveniently thought was consensual actually wasn't, because of the hierarchy and the imbalances of power. That was an incredibly lopsided situation. A room full of 3,000 people, a giant 6'6" dude on stage, mic'd up, and he is who he is, telling you to do the thing. And so she did. And she picks up the phone, she dials that poor son of a bitch on the other end, and they break up. And then, oh, by the way, and everyone cheers, and she's done what she had to do, supposedly, in that moment, and yet, right, it wasn't right. And in the credits, they're like, oh, and afterwards they got back together. Now, who knows whether that was for the best for both of them? Who knows whether it was the moment? But either way, what he has been doing is playing with catharsis. And catharsis is, in the Greek sense, the Aristotelian sense, right? It is the breakdown and breakthrough. And they have been, and this is true not just for Tony, but the entire self-help. Jack Canfield does this kind of stuff. Tony Robbins does this kind of stuff. All these folks basically play on these same things. And so the final days become, scream and relive and reenact all of your sufferings, and then let it all go, and then use a little kind of neuro-linguistic programming to rework yourself and say, I am now good and I'm now changed forever. And the realities is we're not all good and we're not all changed forever in a workshop, in a weekend, in a day, or in a night. And what happens is that with all of those promises, there was another one where I think a girl had experienced deep sexual childhood trauma. And I think she wasn't from America. If I remember, she might have been from Europe. And he identifies 3 guys that I think were just purely, coincidentally, sitting around her, anoints them / appoints them to be her uncles, which if you think about the context of her trauma is a little bit creepy and suspect, and that they all swear and commit to be holding her, supporting her, and sort of becoming infinite, blood brothers, bosom buddies thereafter. And you think, really? Like, is that how life works? Is that how people work? Is that actually how healing is done? How relationships are formed? And also, who are these three random dudes? And if she was having trust around the masculine not being a safe space, or and you've just named these guys because they happen to have butts in seats next to her, it seems wildly irresponsible. It seems wildly irresponsible. And so what's happening is that people are, not people, teachers, workshop leaders, personal growth, personal coaches, all these kind of things, are taking our yearning to move up Maslow's pyramid, and we're actually, and cynically exploiting it to create carefully constructed state experiences. I leave my ordinary self, I get amped up, I have all the neurochemistry of a peak arousal experience, norepinephrine, dopamine, we do our hugging, we do our eye gazing, we do all this stuff. So I create serotonin, I create oxytocin, I create all of these bonding and euphoric learning experiences. And I sell the story that it can all be done right now. And I think the simplest answer, if anybody looks into developmental psychology and any of these kind of components, it's not all done right now. There is a balance. Right, there's a balance between the cathartic breakthrough in the moment, right, and stabilized long-term adult development. And when we don't include that part, we set people up for a tremendous fall. And this is what I mean about the pyramid scheme part, because those state experiences are real. And if you look at the production value that Tony has sunk in to those experiences, it's no different than mega churches. It's even no different than, the Nuremberg rallies that Hitler put on. It's sound, light, movement, chanting, repetition, mass exercise. There's a lot put in to creating that state experience. And the promise of, you're all good now. So people leave on cloud 9, and then invariably, come Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, the next Wednesday, a month later, they have tapered off, and they may not only be a little bit better than they were, but out $5,000, but they might be actually worse than they were, because they've taken apart some of their coping mechanisms and structures, they've shaken them all up, and then they've assumed, I need none of them anymore because I'm fixed, I'm solved, I'm cured, I'm gonna make $1 million, I'm gonna change my marriage or my life or move or whatever it'll be. And yet, most people, that is not how we work, learn, grow, and change. You can have these spiky breakthroughs, they're beautiful, and I'm a huge fan, and they've governed my life, right? But if I could have kept even 50% of every breakthrough I've experienced, I would have been woke a long ass time ago. And strangely, paradoxically, man oh man, I'm still working on the same exact things that have been a part of me, that came out of family patterns and origin, that came out of genetics and proclivities, that just came out of who I am. Right? I'm still working on exactly the same ones that I started on at age 18. Right? Am I a little bit better at it? Hopefully. Right? If I become a little bit more skillful, maybe, ask my kids, ask my wife, right? But the idea that this one and done is a fiction, and we know it's a fiction because what happens at the end of these workshops? What happens at the end of these workshops is you get sent out the door on a puffy pink cloud, and, oh, by the way, in that highly susceptible state, having the living shit out of you upsold to the next super secret platinum experience. So if you want to keep this loving feeling, if you want even more privileged access, if you want to go behind door number 3, it's basically just Scientology without the weird little electric meter, And so what you have is people cynically deploying, right, cultivated states of ecstasy. And so Mike Bryan just said there, engineered ecstasy, absolutely. Right? Cynically deploying it to create peak collective states, not Frederick Turner, Victor Turner at the University of Chicago called communitas, right? That notion where people bond together, creating it, precipitating, and then using it to sell to individual insecurities with a completely false and unsustainable promise of instantaneous cathartic release. And then, when I don't experience it, or when I start backsliding, or when my life doesn't become effortless and easy, what do? I doubt myself, right? I think I must be doing this wrong. I feel bereaved from being cut off, right, from that wonderful, loving feeling that I told should be mine forever. So what do my only real choice, because I don't trust myself, and I'm now probably more rudderless and probably more anxious than I was even prior, I have to go back. And so I put the next workshop on my credit card, whether I can afford it or not, because I've got all the testimonials, all these people who have had that breakthrough experience, supposedly, and if I'm not one of them, I must be doing something wrong. It's like when people get into New Age thinking about cancer and saying cancer is caused by negative thoughts. And you're like, it could be. There could be absolute instances where stress, neurochemical, like perpetual stress arousal in our system, creates inflammation and doesn't do good things for our body, our immune system, etc. Totally valid, possible inquiry. But when people go down the road of saying all cancer is nothing more than, right, bad thoughts in our head, then someone has cancer, and what's the first thing they do? They start doubting and blaming themselves. That's fucked up and wrong, right? So a lot of times when people sell a solution that sounds too good to be true, they are often kneecapping our agency and our autonomy and our dignity, right, for being human and muddling through this and never quite being perfect and figuring this out. And so, to point out, that was the ton of Tony Robbins, I am not your guru. And of course, like, what the hell is that for a title? Seriously? I mean, talk about NLP 101, no one notices the negations of a word. So even if you say something, the nots or, people only hear, I am your guru. That was a positional statement. And, kind of like Shakespeare, thinks he protests too much, right? Honestly. Because there's a massive cult of personality surrounding that thing. And I think, as I said, I just think it's old tech. I think it's baby boomer, stale-ass, transactional bullshit. And I think we're all better than this at this point. I think it's really time to move on. And the same goes with things like the law of attraction, which is fundamentally this idea that thoughts become things, right? The idea, and once again, these truths. The reason stereotypes have traction is because there are truths buried in them. There are valid observations of difference, and then they just get calcified and often weaponized, and that's the problem, right? Not that, hey, we're not all the same, we're not all beige, and we're not all just lobotomized robots. So there's difference and variation. Interesting. Well, the same thing goes with the notion that thoughts become things, except the idea that we create 100% of our reality is total and utter bullshit. In fact, the English philosopher Samuel Johnson once famously said, when faced with that kind of an argument, he kicks a rock and he says, I refute it thus, right? So there's the idea that if you think about it, there's probably, this is super like back of the envelope, fuzzy math. But if you think about it, there's probably 1/3 of our reality is just objective data and experience that persists whether we believe in it or not. There's 1/3, which is up to me. It's the stories I tell, it's the data I select, it's the inferences I make out of the entire bit stream of consciousness and reality. I just take 1%, and that 1%, which 1% I take, is agency, is choice. That is up to me, right? And that has a massive, massive impact on how I see things. And then the final third might be our co-created reality, society, culture. What do I think? What do you think? What do we think? And what are the stories we tell and live into? Now, that is to say that 1/3 of our collective experience of reality is entirely up to us. I think that's more than enough, right? That's amazing, and that's game-changing. But to make the leap that 100% of reality, that you're just an element in my dream, and that I'm just an element in your dream, and what we dream together becomes true, it's like, oh yeah, really? Because the test case that I can never get away from, right? Most philosophers have, they talk about the Auschwitz problem, right? And the notion that concentration camps, if concentration camps existed, then how in the hell could there be a benevolent God that allowed that to happen, right? That's kind of like college philosophy 101, right? But when it comes to the law of attraction, I always ask the question, it's the Tibetan Lama and the AK-47 question. Because when we were mountain guiding out in Nepal and Tibet, we spent a lot of time in some of these really remote, high-altitude Tibetan tantric monasteries, in particular, ones that were so high up, they were up at 17,000, 18,000 feet, the Chinese had never even got there, right? And they shared stories with us, and they talked with us. And actually, the Tibetan mountain guide we were with was masquerading under a false passport as a Nepali Sherpa, but was actually ethnic Tibetan and was helping fuel the resistance there. And so we got to hear some just amazing and truly courageous, heartbreaking conversations. And you realize Tibetan spiritual technologies are arguably some of the most sophisticated in the world. And part of the reason was just the fluke of geography and history, which is that there were three different sort of blocks of code or software that happened. There was the original Tibetan Bunpa religion or shamanism, so the indigenous shamanism of Tibet. And then a wave of Hinduism breaks from India, and a wave of Buddhism breaks from China, and they end up in this high alpine tidal pool, and they intermingle. And so Tibetan Buddhism has a lot more kind of magic and juju because of the original Bunpa shamanism. And it's got this really fascinating hybrid between Indian and Hindu techniques and technologies and Chan or Zen Buddhism. And so there's this amazing mix. And for 1,000 years, they lived in this high ground. The Tibetan monastic traditions, basically they had a theocracy. So they said, let's, as a society, put as many of our resources as we can into developing and accelerating spiritual technology. And the lamas and the monastic traditions and the Patala Palace and all these kind of things were developed literally like think tanks, right, to accelerate human consciousness. So you can make a case that out of any culture or society on the planet, these guys have taken it about as far as anyone else has, that we have sort of documented historical records and access to. And, right, it didn't matter how elevated some of those lamas were. You could take a 16-year-old Han Chinese soldier with a Kalashnikov rifle and pop a cap in their ass. And all that knowledge, and all that wisdom, and all that awakening winked out in a moment. Now you can take the sort of geologic, cosmic, karmic view that the Dalai Lama has advocated, which is like, maybe this all had to happen, maybe this is what created the diaspora, maybe this is what propagates this to the West, maybe this is how it has to all go down. And I'm totally open to that as a legitimate thread. But there's also just the reality, which is like, okay, I'm cool with geologic time, I'm cool with cosmic time, but right here, I'm in existential time. You know, I care about this lifetime, I care about this next decade. I have a life and a wife and children and things that matter. So when people kind of go all cross-eyed and fuzzy and say, maybe this is all happening, maybe the poor starving children in Rwanda incarnated themselves in that exact situation because that's the thing they needed to learn next. Well, like, fuck you on the horse you rode in on. That is some callous, self-serving, bourgeois delusion. Right? And back to the Lama and the AK, right? When people say, in fact, you know, and this happens very much in the alternative festival community, that folks, like that sort of Burning Man, Boom Fest, and Vision Fest, all that whole scene is like people doing some rad and legitimate stuff as far as like permaculture, building new things, like creating potentially options for what's next. And quite often, when we start talking about like geopolitics and what might be happening, that people say, oh, no, don't bring in those negative thoughts, right? If we're going to go through this apocalypse rapture thing, we can just think happy thoughts and then that's what will happen. And you're sort of like, well, really? Are you sure? And one of the questions I always have is when people are, in particular, right, are posting up in Baja California or in Costa Rica or Nicaragua or Panama or any of these places fundamentally south of our border, right? Super tempting, right? Relatively cheap land, tropical paradises, pura vida, right? Live large, right? And so many of those folks have been building that. And you're like, well, okay, let's actually just take a look at history, right? Let's actually take a look at history, which is fundamentally, there's over a century of U.S.-led, hegemonic, cynical, corporately driven, intelligence agency-backed bloodshed and violence throughout all those countries. Right? I mean, if you look at the death squads in Guatemala, I mean, Lago Atitlan is a classic example. I mean, Lago Atitlan is this fantastic, gorgeous lake where some original Mayans villages lived up there, were never taken down by the Spanish. I mean, it's gorgeous, and it's like total like stop on the whole international groovy backpacker, tour. And 1990s, man, Guatemalan death squads came and ransacked that place. And so when people talk about, hey, we live with our locals, we speak Spanish, we buy fruits and vegetables from the locals, we're integrated in this community, you're like, well, are you sure? Because let's really take a look at what's going on, right? The U.S. backs these nation states and the governments behind them with shit piles of aid money. They're basically bought, and I wouldn't want to say puppets at this point because it sounds kind of all, 60s era, lefty political, but, fundamentally propped up regimes favorable to international business interests and relative rule of law and respect of private property. All right? What happens if the United States, ifing and whenning, the United States becomes a little more isolationist, becomes a little bit less the kind of Marshall Plan we're stabilizing the world with aid and the World Bank and all these kind of things. But what happens when we decide, hey, screw you guys, we're rolling up the drawbridges and we are no longer subsidizing your nation states with endless aid dollars? Well, how long do you think the guy we helped put in and support stays in office? About 6 months. Right? And then who comes in after them? Well, who comes in after them is, generally speaking, going to be a nationalist. And what then is the experience? The experience is, well, we're no longer beholden to the U.S. because they're not giving us any more money. So we want to reallocate the resources and rebalance the whole gringo thing. And by the way, life is cheap and everybody's got a machete. And so what you see in a split second is you go from, yuppies in paradise, expats doing their groovy thing and thinking they're being really sensitive and aware, to Zimbabwe. Right? If anybody doesn't know your history on that one, right? I mean, Zimbabwe was Rhodesia, and part of the apartheid regime, part of African colonization, all the deeply problematic things, but also a highly prosperous, highly functioning plantation economy. And when Mugabe came in and overtook that, they basically, the native Zimbabweans came in, ransacked, the whites fled, all the capital, all the development went away, the orchards, the farms, all that stuff just got gutted. And in less than a decade, there was more value destroyed in Zimbabwe than it took a century to create. So, and here we are with Mexico south of our border still, unfortunately, teetering and the prospects of being a failed state. So when people say, and this was a long-winded historical frame-up, right, to basically just saying, Churchill 101, he who knows only his own generation remains forever a child. And when you lay that on the magical thinking of the law of attraction, when you lay that on the idea of the only things that are wrong in the world are the things that are inside my mind and my heart, Tony Robbins 101, and with a few more empowering phrases and with a little bit of like deep dive catharsis and loud pumping music and weepy teary-eyed hugs from strangers I'm going to promise that we'll be lifelong friends, and in reality I'm never going to talk to again. Right? All of this becomes a distraction from the work for us to do. And how good is good enough? Right? How good is good enough before we say, hey, I've done whatever, like I've mended and patched the basic shit I need to do. Right? I'm gonna set aside the fiction that there is some fantasy land version of myself, my work, the world, right, that will exist if only I just screw up my eyes and imagine it hard enough. And then we go back and engage this world. Because what I put in the title of this morning's talk was, this idea of like, how is this Maslow's pyramid scheme destroying the world, right? And I mean that sincerely, which is that as long as people with money, power, influence, all of us here, with smartphones to watch this, with spare time on a Saturday, right? We won the genetic and historic lottery 1,000 times over. So if we are crawling up our own arseholes, right, in an endless loop of chasing the mirage of a safe, beautiful, perfect, magical existence that someone else has sold us or promised us, instead of caring for and tending for the least of my brothers, instead of doing the hard things repeatedly, right? That's allocation of time and resources. And we might be in a situation where it's becoming all the more acute, the decisions we make and in what order. So that's it for the setup. Thank you guys for bearing with me on that. I hope that wasn't too wonky and scholarly for a Saturday morning. But Griffin, you just asked, how is state management a distraction? Mindy just asked, Joe, just shared the video, thanks. So Griffin, how is state management a distraction? So great question. I would actually say state management's not a distraction. I would say that state management integrated into a balanced life with focus and purpose outside ourselves, right, is essential. And in our studies, in our work for Stealing Fire, when we were researching high-performing teams and organizations, everything from DevGru and SEAL Team 6 all the way to Google in the early days, to Tony Hsieh at Zappos, all these kind of things, fundamentally, high performers learn to manage their states on demand. And so there's a difference, and when I was talking about Maslow's pyramid scheme, meaning the cynical adoption of that kind of stuff to commercial transactional ends, that's, to me, the money changes in the temple. That's the thing that I want to take a loud and unapologizing stand against. But the idea of managing our states to both tune our access to information in non-ordinary states and inspiration, right, that help us, oh yeah, here I am, this is what I'm supposed to be doing, let me go back to my waking state reality and go kick some more ass, that, I think, is absolutely perfect. Right? That is actually an unlocking move for how we do more faster. The question I have, though, is it can very quickly become endless navel-gazing, narcissistic aggrandizement, and or just a cop-out in a cul-de-sac. So Wohenglad has one here. Says, this is the problem with economic and political meddling. This is the problem with rational, logical thinking. We can't know the effects of our actions. And the best intentions often lead to, and I'm not quite sure what that said because I ran out of text there. But yeah, I mean, to the notion of like this is the problem with political and social action, I would say, and this was the premise or kind of the coda, more to the point, of our talk in New York this week, which was, so okay, we're getting really good at shifting states of consciousness. We're getting really good at experiencing ecstasis, these moments outside ourselves. The question remains, what do we do? Right? What do we do with it? And you can make the case that, and I don't know, I mean, if you guys are open to this, I'll walk it through. It'll take like 3 minutes, right? But it's, to me, it's kind of, it's what underpins why would we bother, right? So why would we bother cultivating states, non-ordinary states of consciousness? And you can make a case that because we grow up faster when we do. And there's a lot of research coming from Bob Keegan at Harvard, Bill Torbert at Boston College, lots of researchers who are validating that. In fact, Maslow, way back in the day, the more peak experiences people have within reason and within balanced and mature and responsible integration, but the more peak experiences they have, the further they accelerate up the adult developmental ladder, right? And that was also validated with European business managers and Olympic athletes. And fundamentally, the more peak experiences they have, they were more empathetic and they were more ethical. And Bill Torbert at Boston College and Harvard Business Review said that there's a disproportionate number of highly developed people in positions of leadership. They occupy like 80% of upper management roles, even though they're only 10%, 5 to 10% of the actual broader population. And they actually they lead more successfully through change. And Roger Martin, here's the dean of the business school at Rotman up in Canada, wrote an amazing book called The Opposable Mind. And he said that's what's necessary. He looked at Procter & Gamble's CEO A.G. Lafley. He looked at Martha Graham, the famous dance choreographer. He looked at all kinds of like leading lights and people. He said, well, what do these folks do that helps them kick ass so much, so consistently over lifetimes and careers? And the answer was they have the ability to hold multiple perspectives. The opposable mind. I can take 2 ideas or more ideas and I can hold them in dynamic tension. So thesis, antithesis, synthesis, they are able to do that consistently and reliably. So what does all this have to do with cultivating ecstasis, cultivating those moments outside ourselves or non-ordinary states, right? And fundamentally, you can say that when we step outside ourselves, we, by definition, get to realize, I get to look back and see that that thing I thought was me isn't. It's just a monkey suit. And I can come back to it, I can put it on, right? But I am forever and always aware, right? You can't put that toothpaste back in the tube, right? It's the red pill in the matrix, it's whatever analogy you want to call it. But I'm forever aware that I am no longer what I thought I was, or at least just what I thought I was. And so here's the thought experiment I'll walk you guys through. So developmentally speaking, right, humanity, both as individuals and societies, go through stages. They go from egocentric to ethnocentric, right, to global-centric, to potentially kind of cosmocentric, right? That's the roadmap, at least in theory. Okay, and if you think about a baby, right, for the first year or two, a baby is basically subjectively fused with their mama. They don't know where they end and mama begins, or the rest of their environment. They're just kind of this gooey blob of sentience fused with mama. And then comes this wonderful phase, so gratifying for all parents, known as the terrible twos, right? And why are the terrible twos called the terrible twos? Well, they're called the terrible twos because that is the development of the egocentric stage. And the thing that's interesting about that is, like, the child can only become egocentric. They can only move into that stage by glimpsing one step beyond it. I can only define me as an I once I've articulated there's a you. Right? Makes sense. So egocentric is predicated on understanding there is another besides me. That's what defines me, not you, me. And then the next step is to move to ethnocentric, which is my tribe, family, or band. right? And when I do that, what do I have to do in order to understand my tribe, my family, my band? Well, I have to understand one step beyond it. I have to understand the other. I have to understand who we're not in order to be ethnocentric. And that's usually the tribe of people on the other side of the river or on the other side of town. They wear different clothes, they speak a different language, their skin's a different color, they bow to a different god, right? Whatever that would be, and we can have certainly seen this in the political season, right? A regression to ethnocentric communalism by definition of vilification of another. And then you think about, okay, well, what's going to help us become global-centric? That's the next move. Right? We are all citizens on this planet. We're all in the same little lifeboat Earth, whatever you want to call it. Right? What's going to help us do that? And it would follow. In order for us to have a truly global-centric point of view, arguably one that is essential to address all of these challenges, right? I mean, pollution doesn't stop at state boundaries, right? Food shortages and crises, bioterrorism, like refugee crises, all these things, none of these stop at national boundaries anymore. And they're breaking the old nation-state system, right? They're breaking it. So you can make a sense, okay, so how do we make this arguably critical move to global-centric consciousness? Well, that it would follow that you have to go one step beyond global awareness. Well, what would that? That would be cosmocentric. Now, how the hell do we get beyond being citizens or members of this little planet community? Well, we can look at a technological example, would be the early US astronauts. And how many of them had profound life-changing experiences from space, looking back at Earth, looking back at the little blue marble rotate, saying, there's the Nile, there's the Amazon, there's the Ganges, there's the Rocky Mountains, there's the Himalayas, there's the sun coming up behind this planet that we're all from. There's all of these people going to sleep and waking up and fighting and dying and making and creating, and that is us, right? And it changed many of their lives forever. Edgar Mitchell, who was a little bit loopy, but started IONS, the Institute for Noetic Sciences. There's lots of them that dedicated their lives afterwards to something resembling bringing more global-centric consciousness through. And those are external technologies. That's putting dudes in rockets and shooting them to the moon. There's also internal technologies, what we're talking about with ecstasis, right? Any moments that take us outside ourselves, any moments that boost us up to something higher, right? Whether meditation, whether mystical states, whether smart tech, whether sexuality, whether psychedelics, whether flow states, access point matters not. That we get where we get to does. And that those steps, by stepping outside ourselves, by stepping above and beyond ourselves, we can start cultivating, right, the global-centric consciousness that gives us that opposable mind, that ability to hold complex positions without locking into any one of them at a time, and do the hard, beautiful work, right, of fixing what we need to, and restoring this little blue marble as what it was given to us in the first place. So, sum this all up, right? How are Tony Robbins, right, and the law of attraction folks destroying the world? Arguably, they're selling us a partial bill of goods, that momentary catharsis and breakthrough is the whole shooting match, and denying us the realities that hard work, persistence, courage in the face of sustained adversity, the impossible and unavoidable mindfuck of the human condition, that we're born naked and alone and we die that way, and in between we're self-aware, right? That is a grinder. And as Hemingway said, the world breaks everyone, and only some of us are stronger in the broken places. So if we can go from this myth of easy perfectionism in a weekend or a workshop, if we can go beyond the myth of imagining that all the suffering and pain that we and others experience is simply in our minds, and if we only change the way we think, the world changes too. That's a necessary. It's a sufficient, true but partial, and necessary but not sufficient kind of step. And if we can, in fact, reliably and responsibly cultivate these same states, but not in the service of one and done easy release, right? But in the service of preparing ourselves, informing ourselves, and galvanizing ourselves to do the hard work we all have in front of us, then there's something, but hopefully more meaningful, right? And hopefully, and ideally then let's make art of it, right? It doesn't need to be a slog. We can whistle while we work. And that possibility, once we actually all agree and commit that there is work, good work, profound work, true work to be done, right? That is the game that we're fired up to play and would love to share with you guys. So if you haven't already, feel free to jump on our website and check out the Flow profile. It's a free diagnostic tool. There's a bunch of academics that are using it. 50,000 people have taken it. If you would like to say, how do I get outside myself? Where do I find my zone of genius and full focus? Feel free to check that out, Flow profile. If you're interested in a little bit more of this backstory, a little bit more of the neuroscience, a little bit more of the politics and what's at stake right now, check out stealingfirebook.com. It's coming out in a month. It's 2 years of work. We are incredibly stoked to be sharing this with the world, and we want and need pyromaniacs. We want, this is like, what's her bucket, Lady Gaga's Little Monsters, right? We're going to have pyromaniacs, the folks that are fired up to share this fire and to spread it and to get this into the hands of as many people as possible, because we do believe that now more than ever we need more people to wake up, grow up, and show up. And this book is a breakdown as to the hows, whys, and wherefores of exactly that. So it's great to see everybody. Thank you for all your comments. Super stoked for this conversation and dialogue, and we will see you guys. I'm thinking, barring unavoidable travel, we're going to be back on a more regular schedule on these Facebook Lives, and yeah, looking forward to continuing the conversation with everybody. Be well, folks.